In a quiet Florida courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Pam Bondi, a young and determined prosecutor, stood at the center of it all. She was known for her sharp mind and unshakable determination, but today she faced one of the toughest challenges of her career. Across from her sat Judge Harold Grayson, a man whose reputation preceded him. He was notorious for his sharp tongue, questionable ethics, and an almost arrogant belief that no one could touch him. The case they were handling was a high-profile corruption scandal involving a wealthy businessman accused of bribing local officials to secure lucrative government contracts. What started as a routine trial would soon spiral into a dramatic battle that would leave its mark on everyone involved. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial began. Reporters filled the benches, eager to capture every detail of what promised to be a sensational case. Spectators whispered among themselves, speculating about how things might unfold. Some admired Bondi's courage in taking on such a powerful opponent, while others doubted she had the experience to go head-to-head with someone like Judge Grayson. As the proceedings commenced, it quickly became apparent that this wasn't going to be a fair fight, at least not by traditional standards. From the moment Bondi opened her mouth to present her opening arguments, Judge Grayson made it clear he intended to make her life difficult. Judge Grayson interrupted Bondi repeatedly, cutting her off mid-sentence and dismissing her points before she could fully explain them. His tone was condescending, dripping with sarcasm as he questioned her competence and challenged her authority in front of the jury. "Ms. Bondi," he said with a smirk, "are you sure you're ready for a case of this magnitude? Perhaps you should stick to simpler matters." The courtroom fell silent as all eyes turned to Bondi, waiting to see how she would respond. But instead of crumbling under the pressure, Bondi remained calm. Her voice steady, she addressed the judge respectfully but firmly. "Your Honor," she replied, "I am here to ensure justice is served, and I will present my case accordingly." As the morning wore on, Bondi laid out her argument with precision. She explained how the defendant, a well-connected businessman named Richard Langley, had used bribes to manipulate government officials into awarding him contracts worth millions of dollars. She presented emails, financial records, and witness testimonies to support her claims. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of Langley's corrupt practices. Yet despite the strength of her presentation, Judge Grayson continued to undermine her efforts. He dismissed key pieces of evidence as irrelevant, claiming they lacked sufficient proof or violated procedural rules. At times, his interruptions were so frequent that it seemed impossible for Bondi to finish a single thought without being challenged. What made the situation even more complicated was the growing suspicion that Judge Grayson might have ties to Langley. Whispers circulated among spectators about their alleged connection through mutual business associates. Rumors suggested that Grayson had attended lavish parties hosted by Langley and had even received expensive gifts from his company in the past. While nothing had been proven yet, Bondi couldn't ignore the possibility that Grayson's behavior was motivated by something deeper than mere disdain for her abilities. She decided to keep digging, knowing that uncovering the truth could be the key to breaking the case wide open. Despite the hostile environment, Bondi refused to let Judge Grayson intimidate her. Every time he tried to throw her off course, she found a way to stay focused. When he ridiculed her lack of experience compared to Langley's seasoned defense attorney, she countered by pointing out that justice shouldn't depend on who had the most years in practice, it should depend on the facts. When he attempted to discredit her witnesses, she calmly highlighted inconsistencies in the defense's arguments. And when he threatened to hold her in contempt of court for pushing back against his rulings, she reminded him that the law protected her right to advocate for fairness. Her composure only seemed to frustrate Grayson further, fueling his determination to break her resolve. By lunchtime, the courtroom atmosphere was electric. People filed out into the hallway, buzzing with theories about what might happen next. Some praised Bondi for standing her ground against such a formidable opponent, while others speculated that Grayson's antics might ultimately backfire. Meanwhile, Bondi retreated to a small conference room to regroup with her team. They reviewed notes, strategized their next moves, and discussed potential weaknesses in the defense's case. It was exhausting work, but Bondi knew she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not for a second. This wasn't just about winning a trial, it was about proving that integrity mattered, even when faced with overwhelming odds. Back in the courtroom after lunch, the tension reached new heights. Bondi resumed her presentation, carefully weaving together threads of evidence to build a compelling narrative. She highlighted patterns of behavior that pointed to a systematic effort to exploit the system for personal gain. She emphasized the impact of Langley's actions on ordinary citizens, arguing that corruption at this level undermined public trust and damaged the very foundation of democracy. Her words resonated with many in the room, including some members of the jury who nodded thoughtfully as she spoke. For the first time since the trial began, it felt like momentum might be shifting in her favor. But Judge Grayson wasn't about to give up without a fight. As the afternoon dragged on, he grew increasingly agitated. His interruptions became louder, his criticisms harsher, and his demeanor more erratic. At one point, he leaned forward in his chair, glaring at Bondi as if trying to intimidate her into submission. "Enough," he barked, slamming his gavel down hard enough to startle everyone in the room. "Ms. Bondi, your theatrics are wasting everyone's time. If you have nothing substantial to offer, perhaps we should move on." The gallery erupted in murmurs, shocked by the judge's blatant hostility. Bondiff, however, remained unfazed. With a slight smile, she simply replied, "Your Honor, I assure you, the substance of my case speaks for itself." As the day drew to a close, Bondi left the courtroom feeling both drained and invigorated. She knew she had made progress, but she also understood that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Judge Grayson's interference had slowed her down, but it hadn't stopped her. If anything, it had strengthened her resolve to see this through to the end. Back at her office late that evening, she pored over documents and prepared for the next phase of the trial. Somewhere deep inside, she felt a flicker of hope, a belief that no matter how powerful or corrupt her opponents might be, the truth still had the power to prevail. Little did she know, the real drama was only just beginning. The second day of the trial began with a heavy cloud hanging over the courtroom. Pam Bondi walked in with her head held high, clutching a stack of documents that she hoped would turn the tide in her favor. She knew Judge Harold Grayson would continue to make her job difficult, but she also knew she couldn't let his antics distract her from the bigger picture. As the room filled with spectators and reporters eager to see how things would unfold, Bondi took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was there: to fight for justice, no matter the cost. Judge Grayson wasted no time resuming his hostile behavior. From the moment the proceedings began, he seemed determined to control every aspect of the trial. He interrupted Bondi constantly, often cutting her off mid-sentence as if trying to prevent her from making her points. "Ms. Bondi," he said with exaggerated patience, "must we endure this endless parade of irrelevant details? Surely you can get to the point." His tone was dripping with sarcasm, and some members of the jury exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether they should trust Bondi's arguments or side with the judge's dismissive attitude. But Bondi didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she calmly continued presenting her evidence, explaining each document and testimony in clear, simple terms so that even the least knowledgeable person in the room could understand. One of the key pieces of evidence Bondi introduced that day was a series of emails between Richard Langley, the wealthy businessman accused of bribery, and several government officials. These emails revealed conversations about secret payments and promises of favors in exchange for lucrative contracts. Bondi highlighted specific phrases and dates, showing how Langley had orchestrated a systematic plan to manipulate the system for his benefit. It was damning evidence, and the gallery erupted in murmurs as she displayed the emails on a projector screen. However, just as the momentum seemed to shift in her favor, Judge Grayson intervened once again. "This is hearsay," Grayson bellowed, slamming his gavel down hard enough to silence the entire room. "Ms. Bondi, I will not tolerate such speculation in my courtroom. Unless you have direct proof linking these emails to actual criminal activity, I suggest you move on." The defense attorney, sensing an opportunity, quickly chimed in, agreeing with the judge and urging him to strike the emails from the record. Bondi, however, wasn't ready to back down. She stood up straighter, her voice calm but firm as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, these emails are part of a larger pattern of behavior that clearly demonstrates intent. If we're not allowed to present them, how can the jury possibly understand the full scope of the corruption involved?" Grayson's face reddened at her defiance, and for a moment it looked like he might explode with anger. But instead, he leaned back in his chair, narrowing his eyes at Bondi as if studying her for weaknesses. Then, without another word, he abruptly called for a recess. The sudden break left everyone confused, including Bondi, who spent the next hour pacing outside the courtroom, wondering what Grayson's next move might be. When the session resumed, it became clear that the judge wasn't done throwing obstacles in her path. As the afternoon wore on, Bondi called her first witness, a former employee of Langley's company who had agreed to testify about the inner workings of the bribery scheme. The witness, a nervous-looking man named David Cole, hesitated at first, glancing nervously at Langley's defense team before answering questions. Bondi did her best to put him at ease, speaking gently and guiding him through his testimony step by step. Slowly but surely, Cole began to open up, revealing details about how Langley used shell companies and offshore accounts to funnel money to officials in exchange for contracts. It was explosive information, and the jury listened intently, scribbling notes as Cole spoke. But Judge Grayson wasn't about to let Bondi have the upper hand for long. Just as Cole was describing a particularly incriminating transaction, Grayson interrupted yet again. "Objection sustained," he declared, despite no one having formally objected. "This line of questioning is leading the witness, and therefore, inadmissible." Bondi froze, stunned by the blatant bias in his ruling. Before she could protest, Grayson instructed Cole to stop talking and dismissed him from the stand altogether. The gallery erupted in whispers, and even some of the jurors looked visibly frustrated by the judge's interference. Bondi clenched, her fist under the table, struggling to maintain her composure. Outside the courtroom during another recess, reporters swarmed around Bondi, firing questions about how she planned to handle the judge's obstruction. "Is it true that Judge Grayson is protecting Langley?" one reporter asked pointedly. Bondi hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I'm here to focus on the facts of the case," she replied diplomatically. "My job is to ensure that justice is served regardless of any challenges we may face." Her measured response only fueled more speculation, and by the end of the day, headlines were already circulating about the corrupt judge and the brave prosecutor locked in a battle of wills. Back in her office late that evening, Bond isn't stopped working. She reviewed transcripts, analyzed evidence, and strategized with her team about how to counteract Grayson's tactics. They discussed filing motions to have him recused from the case due to apparent bias. But Bondi knew it was a risky move. If their motion failed, it could embolden Grayson even further, making her position even more precarious. Still, she couldn't ignore the growing evidence suggesting that Grayson might indeed have ties to Langley. Rumors about expensive gifts and lavish parties kept surfacing, and Bondi decided it was time to dig deeper. Her investigation led her to an unexpected source, a retired clerk who had once worked closely with Grayson. The clerk, an elderly woman named Margaret, agreed to meet Bondi discreetly at a quiet cafe downtown. Over coffee, Margaret revealed shocking details about Grayson's past dealings. She claimed to have witnessed him accepting envelopes stuffed with cash and attending private dinners hosted by influential figures like Langley. "He thinks he's untouchable," Margaret said bitterly. "But I always knew someone would come along and expose him someday." Bondi thanked her profusely, realizing that Margaret's testimony could be the key to breaking the case wide open. Armed with this new information, Bondi returned to court the following morning, determined to turn the tables on Grayson. As the trial resumed, she subtly began introducing hints of the judge's misconduct into her arguments, careful not to cross any legal boundaries. She referenced vague connections between Langley and certain public figures, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury. Grayson, sensing her strategy, grew increasingly agitated, his interruptions becoming more frequent and aggressive. At one point, he even threatened to hold Bondi in contempt of court if she continued insinuating baseless accusations. Despite the mounting pressure, Bondi pressed on, refusing to let Grayson intimidate her. By the end of the day, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she also believed that the truth was finally starting to surface. As she packed up her files and prepared to leave the courthouse, she glanced back at the empty bench where Grayson had sat earlier. For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile. No matter how hard he tried to silence her, she was determined to make sure his secrets and Langley's crimes came to light. The real showdown was still to come, but Bondi was ready. The third day of the trial began with an air of anticipation that was almost palpable. Pam Bondi arrived at the courthouse early, clutching a folder filled with new evidence she hoped would finally tip the scales in her favor. The previous evening's meeting with Margaret, the retired clerk, had given her a glimmer of hope. Armed with fresh insights into Judge Harold Grayson's questionable behavior, Bondi felt more confident than ever. Still, she knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy. Grayson was growing increasingly desperate, and his hostility toward her showed no signs of abating. As spectators filed into the courtroom, murmurs rippled through the crowd about what might happen next. When the proceedings began, Bondi wasted no time diving into her case. She called another witness to the stand, a former government official who had worked closely with Richard Langley during the period when the alleged bribes took place. The witness, a middle-aged man named Michael Torres, looked nervous but determined as he raised his hand to swear an oath. Bondi approached him with care, asking simple questions to ease him into his testimony. Slowly, Torres began to recount how Langley had pressured officials to award him contracts in exchange for cash payments and other favors. He described late-night meetings in secluded offices, envelopes stuffed with money-changing hands, and promises of future rewards if they cooperated. As Torres spoke, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Even some members of the jury leaned forward, their faces reflecting a mix of shock and disbelief. It was clear that his testimony painted a damning picture of Langley's corrupt practices. But just as things seemed to be going Bondi's way, Judge Grayson intervened once again. "Ms. Bondi," he snapped, cutting her off mid-question, "this is nothing more than hearsay. Unless this witness can provide concrete proof of these so-called transactions, I see no reason to allow this line of questioning to continue." His voice carried an edge of irritation, and it was obvious he was trying to shut down the testimony before it could do any real damage. Bondi didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly turned to face the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her tone respectful but firm, "Mr. Torres is providing first-hand accounts of events directly tied to the charges against Mr. Langley. If we cannot explore these details, how can the jury possibly make an informed decision?" Her words hung in the air, and for a moment there was silence. Grayson stared at her, his jaw tightening. Then, without responding, he instructed Torres to step down from the stand and dismissed him from the courtroom. The gallery erupted in murmurs, and even some jurors exchanged uneasy glances, clearly frustrated by the judge's interference. Undeterred, Bondi pressed on. She shifted gears, focusing on introducing financial records that linked Langley to suspicious transactions. These documents included bank statements showing large sums of money being transferred to offshore accounts controlled by shell companies. Bondi explained how these companies were used to funnel bribes to government officials, creating a web of corruption designed to evade detection. As she presented each piece of evidence, she made sure to simplify the language, ensuring that everyone in the room, even those unfamiliar with financial jargon, could understand the significance of what she was saying. But Grayson wasn't about to let her gain momentum. Every time Bondi tried to connect the dots between the financial records and Langley's actions, the judge interrupted her. "Irrelevant," he barked repeatedly, waving his hand dismissively. "Move on, Ms. Bondi, or I'll have no choice but to hold you in contempt." His threats grew louder and more frequent, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for Bondi to present her case without being sidelined. Despite this, she remained composed, refusing to let his aggression rattle her. Each time he cut her off, she simply paused, took a deep breath, and continued where she left off, determined not to let him derail her efforts. Outside the courtroom during a recess, reporters swarmed around Bondi, eager to get her reaction to the judge's behavior. "Do you believe Judge Grayson is biased in favor of Mr. Langley?" one journalist asked bluntly. Bondi hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I'm here to focus on the facts of the case," she replied diplomatically. "My priority is ensuring that justice is served, regardless of any challenges we may face." Her measured response only fueled more speculation, and by the end of the day, headlines were already circulating about the corrupt judge and the relentless prosecutor, locked in a fierce legal showdown. Back in her office later that evening, Bondi reviewed the day's events with her team. They discussed strategies for countering Grayson's tactics, including the possibility of filing a formal complaint against him for bias. However, Bondi knew such a move came with risks. If their motion failed, it could give Grayson even more leverage to undermine her case. Still, she couldn't ignore the mounting evidence suggesting that Grayson had ties to Langley. Margaret's revelations about the judge accepting gifts and attending private dinners, hosted by influential figures, weighed heavily on her mind. She decided it was time to take a bold step. The next morning, Bondi arrived at the courthouse with a plan. During the trial, she subtly began introducing hints of Grayson's misconduct into her arguments. She referenced vague connections between Langley and certain public figures, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury. While she avoided making direct accusations, her implications were clear enough to make Grayson visibly uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat, his face reddening as he glared at her from the bench. "Ms. Bondi," he warned, his voice tight with anger, "if you continue insinuating baseless accusations, I will have no choice but to take action." Bondi responded with calm confidence. "Your Honor, I am merely presenting the facts as they relate to the case. If there are concerns about impartiality, perhaps it is worth addressing them openly." Her words struck a nerve, and Grayson slammed his gavel down hard, calling for yet another recess. As the courtroom emptied, Bondi allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She knew she was walking a fine line, but she also knew that exposing the truth was the only way to win this fight. When the trial resumed, Bondi introduced a key piece of evidence: photos obtained from Margaret showing Grayson attending one of Langley's lavish parties. In the images, Grayson appeared relaxed and jovial, mingling with Langley and other powerful figures. Bondi projected the photos onto a screen for everyone to see, pointing out the dates and locations. "Your Honor," she said, turning to face Grayson directly, "these photographs raise legitimate questions about your involvement with individuals connected to this case. Can you explain why you attended such events?" The courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on Grayson as he struggled to respond. For the first time, Grayson looked rattled. He stammered, attempting to dismiss the photos as irrelevant while avoiding eye contact with the gallery. Bondi seized the opportunity, pressing further. "If there is any appearance of bias, Your Honor, it is crucial that we address it transparently to maintain the integrity of this trial." Her words resonated with many in the room, including some jurors who nodded in agreement. Grayson's face flushed with embarrassment, and he abruptly called for another recess, retreating to his chambers. As the day drew to a close, Bondi left, the courthouse feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would still be fraught with challenges, but she also believed she had finally gained the upper hand. For all his attempts to intimidate her, Grayson's own actions were beginning to unravel. Back in her office, she reviewed the day's transcripts, strategizing her next moves. Tomorrow would bring new battles, but Bondi was ready. She had come too far to back down now, and she was determined to see justice prevail, not just for herself, but for everyone watching. The fourth day of the trial began with a tense atmosphere that seemed to hang heavy over the courtroom. Pam Bondi arrived early, her mind racing with strategies and possibilities. The previous day's revelation about Judge Harold Grayson's attendance at Richard Langley's lavish parties had sent shockwaves through the case. Now, everyone was waiting to see how Grayson would respond. Would he try to brush it off as irrelevant, or would he lash out in anger? Bondi knew this was a critical moment. If she played her cards right, she could expose the judge's bias and turn the tide decisively in her favor. As the courtroom filled with spectators, reporters, and curious onlookers, whispers buzzed like static electricity. People speculated about what might happen next. Some admired Bondi's courage in challenging such a powerful figure, while others doubted whether she could withstand the storm Grayson was sure to unleash. When the judge finally entered the room, his usual air of confidence seemed shaken. His steps were slower, his expression more guarded. He took his seat behind the bench without making eye contact with anyone, including Bondi. It was clear that the photos presented the day before had rattled him, though he tried hard not to show it. Bondi wasted no time diving back into her case. She called another witness, a forensic accountant named Sarah Klein who specialized in uncovering financial fraud. Klein had spent weeks analyzing the documents related to Langley's shell companies and offshore accounts. With precision and clarity, she explained how these entities were used to launder money and funnel bribes to government officials. Using charts and graphs projected onto a screen, she broke down complex transactions into simple terms anyone could understand. Her testimony painted a damning picture of corruption, leaving little room for doubt about Langley's guilt. But Judge Grayson wasn't about to let Bondi build momentum unchallenged. As Klein spoke, Grayson grew increasingly agitated. He interrupted repeatedly, questioning the relevance of her analysis and accusing Bondi of wasting the court's time. "Ms. Bondi," he snapped, "this so-called expert is merely speculating. Unless she has concrete proof tying these transactions directly to criminal activity, I fail to see the point." His tone was sharp, almost desperate, as if he was trying to distract from the mounting evidence against Langley and himself. Bondi didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she calmly addressed the judge. "Your Honor, Ms. Klein's expertise provides context for the financial records we've submitted as evidence. Without understanding how these transactions work, the jury cannot fully grasp the extent of the corruption involved." Her voice remained steady, her demeanor professional. She then turned back to Klein, asking her to elaborate on specific examples of suspicious activity. Despite Grayson's interruptions, Klein continued her testimony, methodically connecting the dots between Langley's actions and the broader scheme of bribery. Outside the courtroom during a recess, reporters swarmed around Bondi, eager for updates. "Do you think Judge Grayson will recuse himself?" one journalist asked pointedly. Bondi hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I am focused on presenting the facts of the case," she replied diplomatically. "If there are concerns about impartiality, those decisions rest with the appropriate authorities." Her measured response only fueled more speculation, and by the end of the day, headlines were already circulating about the shaken judge and the unstoppable prosecutor. Back inside the courtroom, Bondi introduced yet another piece of evidence. Phone records showing frequent calls between Grayson and Langley during key periods of the alleged bribery scheme. These records revealed patterns of communication that suggested collaboration, or at least familiarity between the two men. Bondi highlighted specific dates and times, linking them to events mentioned earlier in the trial. "Your Honor," she said, turning to face Grayson directly, "these records raise questions about your relationship with Mr. Langley. Can you explain why you were in regular contact with him during these critical times?" Grayson's face flushed red, and for a moment he looked like he might explode. Instead, he leaned forward, gripping the edge of the bench tightly. "Ms. Bondi," he growled, his voice trembling with barely contained anger, "you are treading dangerously close to contempt of court. I will not tolerate baseless accusations or insinuations." But Bondi stood her ground, her expression calm but resolute. "Your Honor, I am simply presenting evidence relevant to the case. If there are explanations for these communications, perhaps they should be addressed openly." The tension in the room was palpable. Even some members of the jury exchanged uneasy glances, clearly troubled by the implications of Bondi's questions. Grayson slammed his gavel down hard, calling for an abrupt recess. As the gallery emptied, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many believed Bondi had struck a nerve, exposing cracks in Grayson's facade. For the first time, it seemed possible that the judge might actually be vulnerable. During the break, Bondi met with her team to strategize their next moves. They discussed filing a formal motion to have Grayson recused from the case due to apparent bias. While Bondi knew this was a risky step, she also understood that it might be necessary to ensure a fair trial. "We need to push harder," she told her team firmly. "If we don't address this now, it will only get worse." Together, they drafted a detailed motion outlining the evidence suggesting Grayson's misconduct and prepared to submit it to higher authorities. When the trial resumed, Bondi pressed forward with renewed determination. She shifted her focus to the impact of Langley's corruption on ordinary citizens. She introduced testimonies from small business owners who had been shut out of government contracts because they refused to pay bribes. One woman tearfully described how her company had gone bankrupt after losing out to Langley's fraudulent bids. Another man recounted how his family had suffered financially when he lost his job due to budget cuts caused by Langley's inflated contract prices. Their stories humanized the case, reminding everyone in the room, including the jury, why justice mattered. As the afternoon wore on, Bondi delivered a powerful closing argument for the day. She summarized the evidence presented so far, weaving together threads of financial records, witness testimonies, and phone records into a cohesive narrative. She emphasized the systematic nature of Langley's corruption and the devastating consequences it had wrought on innocent people. Then, with quiet confidence, she turned to Grayson. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm but respectful, "justice demands transparency. If there are doubts about impartiality in this courtroom, it is our duty to address them honestly and openly." For a long moment, Grayson sat frozen, his face pale and strained. The weight of Bondi's words, and the growing scrutiny surrounding him, seemed to press down heavily. Finally, he rose abruptly, announcing that the trial would adjourn until the following morning. As he exited the courtroom, his usual swagger was gone, replaced by a stiffness that betrayed his unease. That evening, Bondi returned to her office exhausted but invigorated. She reviewed the day's events, confident that she had made significant progress. The walls were closing in on Grayson, and she could sense his grip on the trial slipping. Still, she knew the fight wasn't over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Bondi was ready. She had come too far to give up now, and she was determined to see justice prevail, not just for herself, but for everyone counting on her to stand up against corruption. The fifth day of the trial began with a sense of anticipation that crackled through the courtroom like electricity. Pam Bondi arrived early, her mind sharp and focused. She knew this was a pivotal moment in the case, a day that could either solidify her progress or see Judge Harold Grayson attempt to regain control. The evidence she had presented so far painted a damning picture of corruption involving Richard Langley and raised serious questions about Grayson's impartiality. Now all eyes were on how the judge would respond to the mounting pressure. As spectators filled the benches, whispers spread like wildfire. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, eager to capture every detail of what promised to be a dramatic showdown. When Grayson entered the room, his usual commanding presence seemed diminished. His steps lacked their usual confidence, and his face was etched with tension. He avoided meeting Bondi's gaze as he took his seat behind the bench, signaling that the weight of recent revelations was beginning to take its toll. Despite his efforts to appear composed, it was clear that cracks were forming in his carefully constructed facade. Bondi wasted no time diving back into her case. She started the day by presenting testimony from yet another witness, a former assistant district attorney named Rachel Meyer, who had worked closely with Grayson during earlier legal proceedings. Meyer recounted instances where Grayson had openly praised Langley, describing him as a valuable ally and someone who knew how to get things done. Her words sent ripples through the courtroom, further fueling suspicions about the judge's ties to the defendant. Bondi guided Meyer skillfully through her testimony, ensuring each detail added to the growing narrative of collusion. But Grayson wasn't about to let Bondi dominate unchecked. As Meyer spoke, he interrupted repeatedly, accusing Bondi of dragging irrelevant personal opinions into the trial. "Ms. Bondi," he snapped, his voice tinged with frustration, "this is nothing more than character assassination. I will not allow you to tarnish my reputation based on hearsay." His tone grew sharper with each outburst, betraying his desperation to shut down the line of questioning before it went too far. Yet Bondi remained unfazed, calmly addressing the judge while keeping her focus on the witness. "Your Honor," she replied respectfully but firmly, "these accounts are relevant because they highlight potential biases affecting the fairness of this trial. If there are concerns about impartiality, we must address them openly." Her calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate Grayson further. His face reddened, and for a moment it looked like he might lose control entirely. Instead, he slammed his gavel down hard, calling for an abrupt recess. As the gallery emptied, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many believed Bondi had struck another nerve, exposing even deeper cracks in Grayson's armor. During the break, Bondi met with her team to strategize their next moves. They reviewed transcripts, analyzed evidence, and discussed the possibility of escalating their motion to have Grayson recused. While Bondi knew such a step carried risks, Grayson could retaliate by throwing up more obstacles. She also understood it might be the only way to ensure a fair trial. "We need to push harder," she told her team firmly. "If we don't act now, he'll use every trick in the book to protect himself and Langley." When the trial resumed, Bondi introduced one of her most explosive pieces of evidence yet: audio recordings of conversations between Grayson and Langley discussing bribe payments. In the recordings, Grayson's voice could clearly be heard thanking Langley for taking care of certain matters and promising to return the favor when needed. The gallery erupted in gasps as Bondi played the clips for everyone to hear. Even some members of the jury exchanged shocked glances, visibly disturbed by the implications of what they were hearing. Grayson sat frozen at the bench, his face pale and stricken. For a moment it seemed like he might deny the authenticity of the recordings, but the unmistakable sound of his own voice left little room for argument. Instead, he leaned forward, gripping the edge of the bench tightly. "Ms. Bondi," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained anger, "you are crossing a line that cannot be uncrossed. These recordings are fabricated, and I will not stand for this slander in my courtroom." But his protests rang hollow, especially when Bondi produced documentation proving the recordings were genuine. Bondi seized the opportunity, pressing her advantage. "Your Honor," she said, turning to face Grayson directly, "if these recordings are indeed false, perhaps you should explain why your voice is on them discussing bribes. Transparency is essential to maintaining trust in our justice system." Her words resonated throughout the courtroom, leaving Grayson cornered. For the first time, it seemed possible that the judge might actually crumble under the weight of his own misconduct. Outside the courtroom during another recess, reporters swarmed around Bondi, firing questions about the recordings and their implications. "Do you believe Judge Grayson should step down?" one journalist asked pointedly. Bondi hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I am here to ensure justice is served," she replied diplomatically. "If there are legitimate concerns about impartiality, those decisions rest with the appropriate authorities." Her measured response only fueled more speculation, and by the end of the day, headlines blared about the fallen judge and the relentless prosecutor. Back inside the courtroom, Bondi delivered a powerful closing argument for the day. She summarized the overwhelming evidence against Langley and tied it directly to Grayson's actions. She highlighted patterns of behavior that suggested collaboration between the two men, using the phone records, financial documents, and now the audio recordings to build a cohesive narrative. Then, with quiet confidence, she addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steady and sincere, "justice demands truth. It is your duty to weigh the facts without bias and hold accountable those who abuse power for personal gain." As Bondi finished speaking, the courtroom fell silent. Even Grayson seemed momentarily stunned, unable to muster a retort. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he rose abruptly, announcing that the trial would adjourn until the following morning. As he exited the courtroom, his usual swagger was replaced by a stiffness that betrayed his unease. Spectators filed out slowly, buzzing with theories about what might happen next. That evening, Bondi returned to her office exhausted but invigorated. She reviewed the day's events, confident that she had made significant progress. The walls were closing in on Grayson, and she could sense his grip on the trial slipping. Still, she knew the fight wasn't over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Bondi was ready. She had come too far to give up now, and she was determined to see justice prevail, not just for herself, but for everyone counting on her to stand up against corruption. Late that night, as Bondi pored over files and prepared for the final stretch of the trial, she allowed herself a small smile. No matter how much Grayson tried to intimidate her, she had proven time and again that integrity and perseverance could overcome even the most entrenched systems of corruption. The real showdown was still ahead, but Bondi was ready. She had faith that the truth would ultimately shine through, and when it did, neither Grayson nor Langley would emerge unscathed. The sixth and final day of the trial began with a sense of inevitability hanging in the air. Pam Bondi arrived at the courthouse early, her steps steady but purposeful. She knew this was the day everything would come to a head. The culmination of weeks of relentless effort, sleepless nights, and unwavering determination. The evidence against Richard Langley was overwhelming, and Judge Harold Grayson's misconduct had been laid bare for all to see. Now it was time to deliver the closing arguments that would seal the case. As spectators filled the courtroom, an almost palpable tension gripped the room. Reporters jostled for seats, eager to capture every word of what promised to be a historic conclusion. When Grayson entered, his usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a haunted look that spoke volumes about the pressure he was under. He avoided eye contact with anyone, including Bondi, as he took his seat behind the bench. It was clear that the weight of the recordings, financial records, and witness testimonies had left him cornered. For the first time, he seemed less like an untouchable figure, and more like a man on the brink of collapse. Bondi wasted no time beginning her closing argument. Standing before the jury, she spoke with quiet confidence, weaving together the threads of evidence into a compelling narrative. She revisited the emails showing Langley's bribery scheme, the financial documents exposing his shell companies, and the testimonies from witnesses who had described how corruption had ruined lives. She reminded the jury of the phone records linking Grayson to Langley and played snippets of the damning audio recordings once again. Each piece of evidence reinforced the central theme, that power and greed had corrupted not just Langley, but also those meant to uphold justice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Bondi said, her voice firm yet compassionate, "this case is not just about one man or one judge. It's about protecting the trust we place in our system of justice. When people abuse their positions for personal gain, they betray us all. Your decision today will send a message, not just to Mr. Langley or Judge Grayson, but to everyone who believes they can manipulate the law without consequence." Her words resonated deeply, and even some jurors nodded in agreement, visibly moved by her passion and clarity. As she wrapped up her argument, Bondi turned briefly toward Grayson, meeting his gaze for the first time in days. Her expression was neither triumphant nor vengeful. It was resolute, a silent reminder that the truth could no longer be hidden. When it was the defense attorney's turn to speak, his attempts to discredit Bondi's case fell flat. He tried to cast doubt on the authenticity of the recordings, question the credibility of the witnesses, and downplay the significance of the financial documents. But his arguments lacked conviction, and the jury seemed unimpressed. Even Langley, sitting stoically beside him, appeared resigned to the fact that the tide had turned irreversibly against them. Then came Judge Grayson's turn to address the court. His voice trembled as he read through procedural instructions for the jury, his usual authoritative tone replaced by something closer to desperation. At one point he paused, gripping the edge of the bench tightly, as if struggling to maintain composure. The gallery remained eerily silent, watching as the once feared judge unraveled before their eyes. When he finally finished speaking, there was no gavel slam, no dramatic flourish, just the hollow echo of his words fading into the tense atmosphere. After the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom buzzed with speculation. Reporters huddled outside, dissecting every detail of the trial while awaiting the verdict. Inside, Bondi sat quietly with her team, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. They had faced countless obstacles, from Grayson's hostility to the immense pressure of taking on such powerful opponents. Yet through it all, Bondi had remained steadfast, driven by a belief that justice was worth fighting for. Hours passed before the jury returned, their faces unreadable as they filed back into the room. The foreman stood holding the verdict form and announced their decision: guilty on all counts against Richard Langley. The gallery erupted in murmurs, some applauding softly while others simply stared in stunned silence. Langley slumped in, his chair defeated as deputies prepared to escort him away. But the drama wasn't over yet. Judge Grayson, visibly shaken, attempted one last act of defiance. Rising slowly from his seat, he addressed Bondi directly, his voice cracking with emotion. "Ms. Bondi," he began, his tone bitter and accusatory, "you may think you've won today, but mark my words, your career will suffer for this." His attempt to intimidate her fell flat. Instead, his voice broke and tears welled up in his eyes. For the first time, the man who had spent years wielding power over others was reduced to tears, humiliated by his own actions. Spectators exchanged glances, shocked by the sight of a judge breaking down in public. Bondi didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply looked at him, her expression calm and composed. After a long pause, she spoke softly but firmly. "Your Honor," she said, "justice doesn't care about titles or reputations. It only cares about the truth. Today, the truth prevailed." Her words hung in the air, leaving Grayson speechless as deputies led him away to face internal investigations and potential disciplinary action. As the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed around Bondi, eager for her reaction to the verdict. "What does this mean for the future of our justice system?" one journalist asked. Bondi smiled faintly, choosing her words carefully. "It means that no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. This case proves that integrity and perseverance can overcome even the deepest systems of corruption." Later that evening, Bondi returned to her office, exhausted but fulfilled. She reviewed the day's events, allowing herself a moment of quiet reflection. The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but she had stayed true to her principles. As she packed up her files, she glanced out the window at the city skyline, illuminated by the setting sun. Somewhere deep inside, she felt a flicker of hope, a belief that cases like this could inspire others to stand up against injustice, no matter the odds. The trial of Richard Langley and the exposure of Judge Harold Grayson would go down in history as a defining moment not just for Pam Bondi, but for the community she served. It was a reminder that courage and persistence could shine a light even in the darkest corners of corruption. And though the battle had been hard-fought, Bondi knew it was far from the end. There would always be new challenges ahead, but she was ready. Justice, after all, was a fight worth waging, one day, one case, and one truth at a time.